to degrade the norms of a society has all sorts of second order, third order effects that are unpredictable. And I think one of the ways of seeing the world that I'm particularly interested in is through Girard's mimetic theory.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a normalization process occur, you end up with people mimicking those types of social structures more than they would if it wasn't normalized.
Who maybe
Because,
shouldn't be.
and maybe who shouldn't be. If we take it that polyamory is a very functional relationship structure for a small minority of the population, and they're just trying to normalize it so that they can live in peace. But their process of normalizing it makes it something that other people then consider because it's low cost. It's low cost. There obviously are advantages. You get to sleep with whoever, you get to sleep with more than one person. Let's say it's not necessarily whoever you want to, but
whoever will have you.
Yeah, or whatever the arrangement might be, right?
Sure.
You get to be unrestrained
Mm.
in the way that a monogamous pair bond would basically force you to be. There's obviously an upside to that, especially to somebody maybe who's young or maybe who's high status, and they actually have a lot of sexual opportunities that are being thrown their way, and they probably want to take them. And the idea of having to maintain some sort of archaic bond of chastity to some specific person is a cost. But then when you think about it on the scale of the society, what happens when people start mimicking behaviors that are not good for them? I mean, you end up with a lot of people who are generally confused and unhappy and inflicting harm on themselves, and I think that that's one of the things that people like Jeffrey Miller and Robin Hanson, I mean, he's done a lot of work on this, studying self-deception, studying how much we don't seek information that would help us make rational decisions, but instead we obfuscate for ourselves. We turn to authority. If you like Jeffrey Miller, maybe you'll do what Jeffrey Miller likes, because he's an authority, and so that process kind of ricocheting throughout a whole society where everybody's just looking at what who the influencer is and doing what they do, is just total. It's just total chaos. It's not really an organized culture. It's just birds kind of flying in a flock and trying to match the movement of the other birds. It's not super sophisticated to me. It could lead to sophisticated structures in the future, right? There's a massive exploration that's going on right now. And obviously culture goes through a process of filtration. So you end up with, subcultures, cults that practice certain types of things. And over time, the structures that have some sort of pragmatic truth to them, not like a philosophical truth or a scientific truth per se, but a pragmatic truth to them, tend to win out. Monogamy was doing quite well for quite a long time, and I mean, there's a reason for that. And it's not like people were only seeing, only sleeping with their wives. The story of monogamy, I think, is largely misunderstood, and a lot of that has to do with literally with the diamond industry wanting to get people to buy expensive engagement rings, and the advertising involved in making that happen and creating a market for diamonds. So it's like
the divorce. Is that it? Yeah.
The notions that we have about what monogamy is or what a marriage is, I think they're also very like short-lived cultural phenomenons. And looking into the history of marriage and why it arose in the first place, what kind of evolutionary roles it's playing in terms of organizing mating systems, I think that that's much more of the deeper conversation to be having about marriage and mating structure in society. And you know, I don't really know. For me, the advice that I give to people is know yourself. Don't do something that doesn't work for you. And that's going to require you to really do some interrogation, you know, into your own world, and real, like, being able to recognize, like, oh, I admire this person. This person's polyamorous. It seems to work for them, but I'm not like that. I'm actually not one of these rare people that has these rare characteristics. So I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to have that. I'm not going to have that relationship structure. And that's perfectly fine. Or, I mean, even if you do happen to be one of these people, um, you don't have to also think that polyamory is the best relationship structure. Like, it's really it is a debate. It's not for everyone. I think it really only works for a small portion of people, and it really depends on what your values are in other domains. Like, if
Mhm.
that's really what matters. Ultimately, I think when we're trying to think about what relationship structures ought a society as a whole be supporting and normalizing, let's say.
Right. Well, so one of the things you talked about there briefly was I mean, you were sort of getting at it, but you didn't mention it specifically, at least in that last point, was uh, social media, right? And the way in which it's sort of reconfiguring how we imitate one another, where we get our values from, and and you're correct there that there is kind of no authority. There's sort of these uh, existing structures where authority was previously vested in and that still have some semblance of it, but they're increasingly uh, kind of in their death throes. They're sort of fighting tooth and claw to maintain that authority and maintain an authoritative position within this within all the social networks.
Mhm.
Whereas what's really happening is that increasingly individuals, as well as new institutions, but largely individuals, are becoming various kinds of authority by virtue of the fact that they have a lot of attention and that they are good at acquiring that attention.
Mhm.
Um, and this creates some very, very interesting dynamics, as you would know from your understanding of evolution, that there's going to be some winner take all type dynamics, different kinds of power law distributions that come from basically lowering the walls on everything, just as you would get with globalized trade. Whenever you bring down all of the barriers, you actually increase the inequality in that, whatever the domain is. Um, and one of the offshoots of that I think is potentially dangerous and destabilizing on a sociological level, beyond just the breakdown of sort of traditional family structures and marriage and whatever benefits that might confer to offspring,
Mhm.
is the inequality in terms of relationships and mate choices,
Mhm.
particularly when you're dealing with what's increasingly, and it's probably going to accelerate even further, a large number of men, single men, particularly younger men, who have very few or almost or no mate choices available. And especially with, I would say, the rise of influencer culture, you're going to get even more high status men who have almost all of the choices available. This is a topic that I've covered with other guests before in some of my previous episodes, but what do you think that arrangement is going, how do you think that arrangement is going to affect things? And do you think that there are going to be solutions to it? Because in a lot of the more traditionalist online political spheres, there is this sort of call to uh, return to something like an oppressive institution of marriage or of like single pair bonding in order to sort of alleviate what they see as like a threat of having a large mass of unmarriageable men, basically.
Yeah. I mean, yes, societies with these dynamics are tend to be more violent. Um, as you could just, it's just pretty obvious, like, what kind of dynamics that would create.
They exist, for example, in intense places like the Middle East, for example,
Yeah.
has a lot of these dynamics.
Yeah, exactly. So you end up, yeah, with less stability in society overall, more inequality, and just more general violence and less freedom of movement in that case. A lot of the things that we in the West prize and take for granted. Well, it's interesting because there's other things going on right now as well in terms of mating and dating, like the decrease in fertility rates. I guess in that case, I mean both the fact that people themselves are becoming less fertile, but also the rate of reproduction is going down. Also, the self-reporting of non-straight, sexual proclivities has gone up as well. So bisexuality or being gay, which of course are also structures that they're not reproductive. You can adopt a child, but you can't produce a child from that arrangement. And so there's other types of things that are going on with humans and civilization and reproduction that are quite interesting. I don't really think that as of right now, there's a very good explanation for why this happens. Like, why is it that we reach certain levels of abundance or certain levels of population density and then we stop reproducing at the same rates? It's a curious phenomenon. So I think that there's lots of things going on, and we can try and create a dotted line around a certain phenomena and attempt to understand it from those specific variables. But of course, these systems are open, and there are other influences that are coming in. One of the other influences, of course, is technology itself, the creation of sex bots, the creation of platforms like OnlyFans, AI girlfriends, the proliferation.
They're coming, guys. Don't worry.
Don't worry. And the proliferation of these kind of transactional forms of sexual or intimate engagement, which can also come in to take the place of what would normally be a population of people who are seeking mates and seeking to replicate their genes and foster a new generation. And then, of course, you have the anti-natalists who, don't think that we should be reproducing at all. And this is very much an anti-natalist type of orientation, right? Either just by incident, if not by value. So yeah, the dynamics here in this particular moment of history are I think unusual just because we have technology interfering with our sexuality in such a deep way. Whereas other periods of time in history, if you were a man who was being frozen out of reproductive opportunity, you didn't really you had the option of prostitutes, you had the option of raiding another place to find it, but you didn't have a sex bot as an option. You didn't have going on OnlyFans as an option. So certainly we have different dynamics going on in this, and it'll be really interesting to see. I think part of the trad, the return thing, is a larger frustration with how technology is making us impotent generally. I think a lot of it is wanting to protect the virility of men, and seeing men giving themselves over to these addictive cycles feels like an undermining of, like maybe even the institution of masculinity. Because, in the past, you'd end up with an angry group of men, and it's not like we don't have that. We do, but how are they expressing it? Oh, they go online and they write posts. It's like, okay, well, that's your problem, basically. Like, you're not making it a problem for anybody else, really, besides the fact that you have a subculture that's oriented around this particular grievance. Whereas in other times, men would find each other. They didn't have anything, holding them down, holding them back, a family they had to provide for, any of those things. And they would just go off and get into trouble. And I don't know, like the fact that we're doing so much of our social interaction online, and there are status implications if you get, let's say you get your account removed or something like that, but it's different. I would wager to say that it's different. It has different things going on. And it's important for us to not collapse the trends of the past and just extrapolate or expect the same types of things to happen in our own circumstance. Even if on some very high levels, we can see that there are patterns mirrored in this time and other times in history. But yeah, I don't know what else was. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is the way in which polyamory or non-monogamy impacts men is pretty obvious, but the way in which it impacts women is not as much talked about from what I've noticed. And the way that I think about marriage and monogamous marriage is it's a truce between different demographics, because men with high status in society were able to collect wives as a representation of their wealth, so as property, and the way that gave them the value of wealth was the fact that it was a scarcity, right? You're the man who has all the wives and the rest of the men don't. But even within the structure of being within a harem, like let's imagine you're
Sure.
one of many women that your husband is housing. There's a lot of stuff that happens within that dynamic that is very disruptive to women. And there's all sorts of rivalrous dynamics that go on between women who are in the same harem, who want the attention of the husband, who's having to split all of his resources between these groups, and it ends up being rivalrous between the oldest wife, or the most the wife who's been around the longest, the first wife, and the younger wives, because the younger wives come into a situation where they don't have a lot of power. Oftentimes they're quite young, and they're easily manipulated or controlled by the first wife, and she has every interest in controlling the rest of the wives and their reproduction, how much they have sex with her husband, how many kids there are, the whole thing. And of course, right, like I don't know
how those kids are treated, which ones get more benefits.
Yes, exactly, how they're treated and how much resources that you end up getting. And of course, I think most people in polyamorous relationships are not thinking about polygyny and like being one of 10 wives and there's one husband. But that's the kind of thing that, especially if we change the legal structure, could become much more ubiquitous. Certainly we have enough rich tech people who would have enough resources to be able to provide for many, many wives, and would maybe want to have many, many children. And it's a certain way of organizing people. It's very good for if you have an ideology or a religion. It's great for increasing the population. I think that's a lot of why Mormons, for example, or even the Israelites or the old patriarchs, like, why do you have many wives? Well, if you're trying to populate your particular religious beliefs, the womb is the bottleneck. You can only have as many children as you have wombs. And so the more wives you have, the more babies you can be making, and the more people who follow your ideology or religion. So if you're thinking about replication of a certain type of thought structure, that mating system makes sense on that level. So yeah, it really is particular to whatever ambition any given person has. If you want to be the leader of a cult, polygamy might be good for you, right?
If you have
you
such
gotta
ambitions.
if you have such ambitions, it's probably not a bad structure for you. And if you're living in a society where community is hard to come by, you're high IQ, you're like nobody really wants to have kids, everyone's living in communal houses, and there's a a lot of care given to building social structures, and people want to hang out in cuddle puddles all the time, then maybe polyamory would work really well for you. But I mean, in my situation personally, on some level, I'm like, why are we so fascinated with sex all the time, like sex and relationships? Like, aren't there other things that we should be doing? Like, aren't we dealing with a climate crisis? Aren't we dealing with like a disease? Like, aren't we dealing with political collapse?
Mhm.
Aren't we dealing with like hypercapitalism and atomization? Like, what what about actually taking on the burden of keeping civilization happening? Um, that
Well,
takes a lot of time and energy. It's like,
right.
so I don't know.